It began in the quiet hours before dawn, when most of Kamchatka was still asleep. At 4:12 a.m. local time, deep beneath the cold waters off the peninsula's eastern coast, a massive fault line shifted. Instruments at the seismic stations lit up. Initial readings suggested a magnitude 7.9 earthquake, later revised upward. The ground shuddered violently for nearly a minute, a deep, rolling motion that seemed to swell and fade in waves. In coastal villages, lights flickered, dishes fell, and people scrambled from their beds. The first radio warnings crackled through emergency channels, possible tsunami inbound. By 4:09 a.m., the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center had confirmed what locals feared. A wall of water was on the move. Sirens wailed in fishing towns along the shoreline, the sound cutting through the freezing air. In some places, evacuation drills drilled into residents for years took over. Families grabbed prepared bags and fled uphill. In others, the shock slowed movement. Hesitation hung in the air. 10 minutes later, the first surge hit. Icy seawater pouring through streets, lifting cars, smashing boats against concrete piers. Surveillance cameras caught the chaos, seawater roiling with debris under a dim, grey sky. Then came the shift no one anticipated. At 5:03 a.m., just 50 minutes after the quake, monitoring stations near Klyuchevskoy Volcano picked up an intense harmonic tremor, a signal not from the quake itself, but from magma forcing its way upward. Satellite thermal sensors detected sudden heat blooms on the volcano's flanks. By 5:11 a.m., the mountain's summit cracked open, sending a column of ash and fire roaring into the dawn. Residents who had fled the coast now looked toward the interior, where a dark plume climbed higher than the clouds, lit from within by lightning. In less than an hour, Kamchatka had been hit by 3 disasters in sequence: a major earthquake, a destructive tsunami, and a full-scale volcanic eruption. The soundscape was overwhelming: sirens, rushing water, the deep thunder of the earth itself, and the continuous roar of the volcano. For those who lived it, time fractured into moments of disbelief and survival instinct. For the rest of the world, the timeline unfolded in clips and breaking headlines, a chain reaction of natural forces that had torn through one of the most remote yet volatile corners of the planet. This was not a single disaster. It was a cascading assault, each event feeding into the next, leaving little room for warning, and even less for escape. By 5:18 a.m., the eruption had entered its explosive phase. The column of ash rose at a terrifying speed, reaching nearly 15 kilometers into the atmosphere within minutes. Each burst from the crater was accompanied by a low, concussive boom that rolled across the valleys. Ash began falling on towns more than 50 kilometers away, coating streets, rooftops, and vehicles in a fine grey powder. In the harbour areas, the tsunami's retreat left behind a trail of wreckage: overturned fishing boats, splintered piers, and entire sections of road torn away by the force of the water. Emergency crews trying to reach coastal survivors now had to contend with visibility near zero, as ash darkened the morning sky. Satellite images broadcast on international news channels showed the scale in chilling detail: a swirling ash plume stretching eastward over the Pacific, while ocean buoys tracked the diminishing but still dangerous tsunami waves racing toward distant shores. The quake's epicenter, marked by concentric rings on seafloor maps, sat disturbingly close to several active volcanic zones, suggesting a geological chain reaction that scientists had only theorized until now. Inside Kamchatka's regional emergency center, radios crackled with overlapping reports: collapsed bridges, isolated villages, and injuries mounting by the hour. Helicopters were ordered to lift off as soon as the ash cleared enough for safe flight. For those on the ground, every sound was amplified: the hiss of falling ash, the groan of damaged buildings shifting on unstable foundations, the distant rumble of the volcano that refused to quiet. The sequence of events was no longer just a disaster. It had become a living timeline of destruction, each minute marked by a new escalation, each hour layering one catastrophe over the remnants of another. By 5:27 a.m., the scale of the crisis had become undeniable. In less than 80 minutes, Kamchatka had been struck by an earthquake powerful enough to rupture roads and fracture buildings, a tsunami that devoured entire harbour fronts, and now an eruption throwing ash high enough to darken the morning sky far beyond the peninsula's borders. For those living through it, there was no pause. Each event bled into the next, giving no space to recover or even process what was happening. The air itself was turning toxic, filled with volcanic ash, fine enough to be inhaled deep into the lungs, abrasive enough to clog machinery and cut off engines mid-operation. In the coastal fishing village of Kamchatka, survivors who had fled to higher ground to escape the tsunami now found themselves squinting through a sudden artificial night. The sky was the color of graphite, broken only by the occasional flash of volcanic lightning, an eerie blue-white burst that illuminated the rolling plume for an instant before plunging everything back into shadow. The temperature began to drop rapidly as sunlight was blotted out. Some residents pulled scarves or shirts over their mouths to breathe. Others fumbled with small battery-powered radios, seeking updates from regional broadcasters who themselves were scrambling to maintain their transmissions through the storm of ash. At 5:32 a.m., the Kamchatka Volcanic Eruption Response Team issued its first Level 5 red alert for aviation, the highest possible, signaling that aircraft must avoid the ash cloud at all costs. The warning was relayed to air traffic control centers across the Pacific. Commercial flights already en route between Asia and North America were ordered to divert southward, adding hours to their journeys. Some cargo aircraft, heavy with perishable goods, turned back to avoid risking engine failure. For passengers in mid-air, announcements were terse. There was a volcanic event requiring a change in course. On the ground, the reason was more than clear. By 5:40 a.m., seismic stations across the peninsula were recording a constant harmonic tremor, an unbroken vibration signaling that magma was continuing to rise. Scientists monitoring live feeds from thermal cameras positioned on the volcano's flanks watched as new fissures began to open, spewing smaller fountains of lava down the mountain's slopes. The lava flows were not yet threatening populated areas, but they cut off key mountain passes that connected inland towns to the coast. Rescue routes that had been mapped out for earthquake or tsunami response were suddenly compromised, forcing emergency planners to improvise. The tsunami's second surge, though smaller than the first, came ashore at 5:44 a.m., flooding streets already choked with debris from the earlier wave. In some low-lying districts, the water met the falling ash in a violent hiss, creating thick steam clouds that mingled with the volcanic fallout. Visibility dropped to just a few meters. Vehicles attempting to navigate the streets found themselves stuck in a slurry of mud, seawater, and ash. Rescue workers had to abandon trucks in favor of small boats or on-foot evacuations, carrying stretchers through knee-deep muck. At 5:51 a.m., international news networks began their first live broadcasts from Moscow and Tokyo, relaying satellite images of the ash plume curling over the Pacific. The images were mesmerizing and terrifying in equal measure, a perfect spiral of grey and white, punctuated by the shockwave rings expanding from the eruption site. Analysts on screen began piecing together the timeline. The earthquake had ruptured a section of the Kamchatka Trench, sending shockwaves inland that may have destabilized the magma chamber beneath the volcano. The compression and decompression of rock layers could have been the trigger, though definitive conclusions would take months of study. Meanwhile, in Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky, the peninsula's largest city, emergency shelters began to fill. Gymnasiums, schools, and government buildings were opened to house evacuees from both the coast and the villages closest to the volcano. Volunteers handed out bottled water and basic medical masks, but supplies were running low within the first hour. Power outages rolled across neighborhoods as ash accumulated on power lines, increasing their weight until they sagged and snapped. The constant sound of sirens and helicopter blades filled the air, interrupted only by the guttural roar from the volcano every few minutes as it released another burst of ash and gas. At 6:05 a.m., a dramatic development occurred. Satellite sensors detected that the ash plume had reached the stratosphere, over 20 kilometers above sea level. This meant the particles could potentially circle the globe, affecting weather patterns and air travel for weeks or even months. The implications extended far beyond Russia's Far East. International agencies, from the World Meteorological Organization to the International Civil Aviation Organization, began issuing advisories. Meteorologists warned that depending on the eruption's duration, there could be a measurable impact on sunlight reaching the Earth's surface, at least temporarily cooling temperatures in parts of the northern hemisphere. By 6:15 a.m., the cascading nature of the disaster was fully evident. The earthquake had primed the environment for instability, the tsunami had displaced thousands and crippled coastal infrastructure, and the eruption had blanketed large swaths of the region in ash. Every response effort was slowed by the combined effects: flooded roads blocked with debris, communication lines down, and aircraft grounded or rerouted. The coordination challenges were immense. In the regional command center, maps covered in colored pins and highlighter marks showed where survivors had been located, where rescue teams were operating, and which zones were still unreachable. Even in areas far from the epicenter, the sense of disorientation was total. Ash drifted hundreds of kilometers from the volcano, settling on farmland, contaminating water supplies, and forcing residents indoors. In some places, the darkness was so complete that streetlights flicked on automatically, casting their orange glow onto streets that looked more like a scene from a lunar landscape than a Russian peninsula. Farmers worried about the weight of ash on greenhouse roofs. Fishermen fretted over the state of their boats and nets, now buried under layers of wet, abrasive dust. At 6:29 a.m., a third volcanic vent opened on the volcano's western flank, sending fresh lava flows toward an uninhabited valley. While this posed no immediate human threat, scientists warned it could signal a prolonged eruptive phase. Seismic readings suggested the magma chamber was still under significant pressure. Drones launched from safer distances captured stunning but sobering footage of molten rivers cutting through snowfields, generating massive clouds of steam. By 6:45 a.m., nearly 2.5 hours after the earthquake, the disaster was still unfolding in real time. The sequence of events, quake, wave, eruption, had pushed Kamchatka's emergency systems to their absolute limit. For those watching from afar, it was a rare, harrowing glimpse into how multiple natural forces can intersect, each compounding the damage of the last. For those living it, there was no such perspective, only the next decision, the next movement to safety, the next breath drawn through a mask as the air thickened with ash. Every passing minute added another entry to the timeline, another line in the record of a morning that would be studied by scientists, emergency planners, and historians for years to come. In the disaster's raw chronology, there was no single turning point, only an accelerating chain of cause and effect. From the first tremor to the ongoing eruption, the Kamchatka disaster was a perfect, terrifying example of how nature's forces can align, overwhelming even the best preparations, and reminding the world that on this planet, the ground beneath our feet and the sky above our heads can change in an instant. By 6:52 a.m., the region was operating under a constant state of emergency. The quake's aftershocks continued to rattle the peninsula every 15 to 20 minutes, none as strong as the first, but enough to keep residents on edge and complicate rescue operations. Each tremor sent plumes of ash and dust cascading from unstable rooftops, while loose debris shifted in streets already blocked by wreckage. Emergency crews moved cautiously, knowing that one misstep could mean injury in conditions where medical help was stretched thin. The combination of seismic instability and volcanic fallout had turned much of Kamchatka into a hazard zone, with almost no safe areas left untouched. At 7:03 a.m., the volcanic lightning intensified, flashing in rapid bursts within the towering ash column. For photographers and news crews, it was a rare and mesmerizing phenomenon, fiery streaks crisscrossing a roiling cloud of smoke and ash, but for those nearby, it was just one more sign of the eruption's ferocity. Ashfall was now reaching beyond 100 kilometers, settling in thick layers on roads, fields, and rooftops. The weight began collapsing smaller structures, particularly older wooden sheds and fishing shacks along the coast. Residents scrambled to clear their roofs with whatever tools they could find, even as the air grew harder to breathe. By 7:10 a.m., a grim challenge emerged. Potable water supplies in several towns were already compromised. Ash had contaminated open reservoirs and rooftop rainwater collectors, while tsunami damage had ruptured pipelines. Bottled water, always in limited supply in remote areas, became a lifeline. Relief coordinators urged those with remaining reserves to boil water before use, but with widespread power outages, even that was difficult. In some communities, makeshift filtration stations were set up using cloth and charcoal, a stopgap measure that could not meet long-term needs. At 7:18 a.m., rescue helicopters made their first cautious forays into the disaster zone, skirting the ash plume's edge to avoid engine failure. Their priority was the coastal villages that had taken the brunt of the tsunami, places where communications had gone silent for more than 2 hours. From the air, crews reported entire harbors swallowed by water and debris, fishing fleets splintered, and roads either submerged or buried in volcanic ash. Survivors waved from rooftops or hilltops, signaling for help with pieces of bright cloth. The command center in Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky faced a constant stream of hard decisions. Which communities to reach first, how to allocate dwindling supplies, and where to establish new evacuation shelters as existing ones filled beyond capacity. Satellite communications with Moscow remained intact, allowing national agencies to begin mobilizing military support and long-range transport aircraft to bring in aid from mainland Russia. International offers of assistance started trickling in as well, though any response would take days to arrive, given Kamchatka's isolation. At 7:29 a.m., another vent on the volcano's northeastern flank erupted, sending lava and pyroclastic flows downslope. This raised new alarms, as these fast-moving clouds of superheated gas and debris could travel at highway speeds, incinerating everything in their path. Though the current flows were headed into uninhabited valleys, the event underscored how rapidly the situation could change. Scientists monitoring seismic instruments noted that the eruption showed no signs of slowing. Pressure readings in the magma chamber remained high, suggesting the volcano could remain active for days or even weeks. By 7:40 a.m., the chain of disasters had fully reshaped the morning's reality. Quake damage had fractured infrastructure, the tsunami had erased sections of coastline, and the eruption continued to pour ash into the sky. For Kamchatka's people, the timeline was no longer about hours and minutes. It was about survival from one moment to the next. For the rest of the world, it was a grim sequence playing out in real time, a living reminder that nature can layer catastrophe upon catastrophe until the line between them disappears entirely. By 7:48 a.m., the morning light, what little managed to pierce the ash cloud, was filtered into a dim amber haze. The atmosphere carried a thick metallic scent, a mixture of wet ash, seawater, and sulfur that clung to clothes and skin. For many residents, visibility had dropped to a few meters, forcing them to move in pairs or groups, hands gripping ropes strung between buildings to avoid becoming disoriented in the gloom. Every street and shoreline path had transformed into a labyrinth of debris, fishing nets tangled with uprooted trees, overturned vehicles, and sheets of corrugated metal rattling in the wind. At 7:55 a.m., the first organized rescue convoys began pushing inland from the safer western side of the peninsula. Bulldozers cleared ash-choked roads meter by meter, while smaller all-terrain vehicles ferried medical personnel and supplies. In several villages, survivors emerged from makeshift shelters carrying infants, pets, and hastily packed belongings, many still barefoot from the frantic flight hours earlier. The tsunami had taken what the quake damaged, and now the eruption's steady ashfall threatened to collapse roofs and contaminate every open water source. By 8:02 a.m., field hospitals were being established in gymnasiums and school halls that remained structurally sound. Medical teams treated hypothermia from tsunami exposure, respiratory irritation from volcanic ash, and crush injuries sustained during building collapses. Volunteers handed out improvised masks, simple cloth or surgical coverings, but supplies were already running low. Ash clung to every surface, turning hallways into slippery, gritty corridors. The hum of generators and the occasional burst of radio chatter created an uneasy rhythm, punctuated by the distant rumble of the volcano. At 8:10 a.m., scientists at the Kamchatka Volcanic Eruption Response Team reported that the ash plume had expanded laterally, spreading toward the Aleutian Islands and threatening to interfere with trans-Pacific flight corridors for days to come. Meteorologists warned that if the eruption sustained its intensity, fine ash could cross into North American airspace within the week. The regional government issued a rare stay-indoors advisory for all unaffected inland communities to limit exposure, a measure complicated by ongoing aftershocks that made remaining inside damaged buildings dangerous. By 8:19 a.m., a coordinated evacuation began for the most heavily impacted coastal zones. Military transport trucks loaded with evacuees navigated slowly through ash and debris toward designated reception points farther inland. Loudspeakers on the vehicles repeated instructions in Russian and indigenous Kamchatkan dialects, ensuring that no one misunderstood the urgency. Helicopters, their rotor blades coated in a thin layer of ash, made repeated short trips to lift the injured from isolated pockets where roads had vanished entirely. At 8:30 a.m., roughly 4 hours after the first earthquake struck, the disaster was still very much alive. The quake had shattered the ground, the tsunami had ravaged the coast, and the volcano continued to breathe ash and fire into the sky. The sequence was no longer just a chain of events. It was an unbroken assault, testing the limits of emergency systems, the endurance of first responders, and the resilience of communities whose lives had been rewritten before the sun had fully risen. What began as a single seismic tremor had become a living timeline of catastrophe, one that would take months to understand and years to recover from. By 8:37 a.m., Kamchatka had reached a point where the disaster was no longer a sequence of separate events. It was a single intertwined crisis with multiple fronts of danger. The earthquake's aftershocks continued to rattle buildings already weakened by the initial jolt, while the tsunami's destruction still trapped families in pockets of debris, and the volcano's relentless eruption poured ash into the air without pause. On the ground, every action carried risk. A single misstep could plunge a rescuer into a sinkhole created by waterlogged ash. Every breath came with the metallic tang of sulfur and grit. Even the simplest acts, finding clean water, keeping children warm, sending a message to a relative, had become extraordinary challenges. By 8:45 a.m., evacuation corridors were under extreme strain. Convoys of military trucks, civilian buses, and private vehicles moved in slow, deliberate lines towards safer inland zones, each one escorted by police or emergency service units. The roads, cleared hastily by bulldozers, remained treacherous. Ash and mud combined into a pace that swallowed tires and forced frequent stops for towing and repairs. On both sides of these routes, villagers stood with small bundles of belongings, waiting for their turn to be picked up. Some waved down passing vehicles with urgency, fearing they'd be left behind if the weather worsened or the eruption shifted direction. At 8:53 a.m., reports began coming in of livestock and wildlife fleeing en masse from areas closer to the volcano. Herders drove small groups of animals along the same evacuation routes as people, adding another layer of complexity to the movement of traffic. In the air, helicopters ferried the most vulnerable, the elderly, the injured, and young children, to larger medical hubs. But even the air bridge was fragile. Pilots had to constantly adjust routes to avoid dense ash pockets that could stall engines. Every landing was a calculated gamble. By 9 a.m., coordination between local authorities and Moscow was in full swing. Military logistics units were mapping drop zones for food, water, and emergency shelter kits, while engineers began discussing the possibility of temporary pontoon bridges to replace those washed away by the tsunami. International aid agencies announced they were mobilizing, but geography was the enemy. Kamchatka's remoteness meant that even the fastest deployments from abroad would take days. The window between survival and loss was measured not in weeks, but in hours. At 9:08 a.m., the eruption intensified again. Seismic instruments picked up deep, rhythmic pulses, a sign that new magma was forcing its way upward. Moments later, a fresh column of ash and volcanic gas surged into the sky, rising faster and higher than before. The color of the plume darkened, shot through with bolts of volcanic lightning that forked and vanished in the haze. Winds shifted, pushing the ash cloud toward areas that had been relatively clear earlier in the morning. Shelters that had been considered safe now faced the prospect of being cut off by heavy fallout. The effects rippled far beyond Kamchatka. By 9:15 a.m., air traffic control centers across the northern hemisphere had redrawn flight paths to avoid the growing no-fly zone. Cargo shipments were delayed or diverted, and airline passengers in distant airports found their itineraries disrupted by a disaster they'd only just heard about on the news. Meteorological agencies in Japan, Alaska, and Canada began issuing statements about the possibility of fine ash dispersing into their airspace within days, a reminder that the reach of such an event is global, not just local. On the peninsula, 9:22 a.m. brought a grim tally from the Regional Emergency Center. Multiple villages still unreachable, at least a dozen confirmed fatalities, and hundreds injured. These numbers were certain to rise as access improved. First responders worked with a speed that bordered on reckless, aware that each delay could cost lives. Every minute mattered, pulling someone from rubble before hypothermia set in, reaching a trapped family before ash blocked the only viable exit, delivering clean water before contamination turned into illness. By 9:30 a.m., the human stories began to emerge, even amid the chaos. A teacher guiding her students over a ridge to escape the tsunami's reach. A fisherman using his small boat to ferry people from one submerged street to another. A medic performing CPR in the back of a moving truck, lit only by the faint glow of a headlamp. These moments were snapshots of resilience in the face of overwhelming force, reminders that even in disaster's darkest hours, human instinct leans toward helping others. At 9:42 a.m., the ash cloud reached a staggering 25 kilometers in height, now visible from satellite imagery as a sprawling grey spiral stretching eastward. Scientists warned that if this intensity persisted, the eruption could rival some of the largest in recent decades, with the potential to inject enough particulates into the upper atmosphere to influence regional climate patterns. This wasn't just an isolated catastrophe, it was becoming a chapter in Earth's environmental history. By 9:50 a.m., the scope of recovery was beginning to take shape in the minds of officials. Rebuilding roads, restoring clean water, repairing communication lines, and clearing ash from agricultural land could take months, even years. Fishing fleets would need to be replaced, harbors dredged of debris, and entire neighborhoods reconstructed. Yet for the thousands now huddled in makeshift shelters, the future was a distant thought. Survival in the present moment remained the only priority. At 9:58 a.m., the volcano sent another massive burst of ash skyward. For many watching from evacuation centers, the plume was both a spectacle and a threat, an unpredictable reminder that the ground beneath them was still alive and restless. The noise from the eruption was felt as much as heard, a deep, resonant vibration in the chest that no one present would ever forget. By 10:05 a.m., communications teams had set up loudspeakers in the largest shelters, broadcasting updates every 15 minutes in multiple languages to ensure no one was left uninformed. Aid workers handed out the last of the clean bottled water in one coastal shelter, while soldiers unloaded new supplies from an armored vehicle outside. The sound of helicopters overhead became a constant, the mechanical thump of their blades cutting through the otherwise muffled world beneath the ash cloud. At 10:12 a.m., rescue teams reached a coastal school that had been serving as a refuge since the first earthquake. More than 100 people had gathered inside, barricading the doors against flooding and using blankets to filter ash from the air. They emerged squinting into the dim daylight, faces and hair coated in grey. Some carried pets tucked into jackets, others clutched family photographs sealed in plastic bags. They were loaded onto trucks and driven inland away from both the sea and the volcano. By 10:20 a.m., the disaster had entered its fifth hour. The timeline, once measured in precise minutes, now stretched into an ongoing crisis without a clear endpoint. For those documenting it, scientists, journalists, emergency officials, it was a case study in cascading hazards, how one seismic shift could set off a chain reaction of forces, each compounding the last. For those enduring it, it was simply survival, breath by breath, step by step. The Kamchatka disaster would continue to evolve over the next days and weeks, with aftershocks, shifting ash clouds, and the long, slow process of accounting for the missing. The road to recovery would be steep, shaped not only by rebuilding structures, but by restoring the sense of security shattered in those first chaotic hours. For the rest of the world, the message is stark. Natural forces do not wait for us to be ready. They arrive in waves, sometimes literally, and can turn a normal morning into a fight for survival in less time than it takes to make breakfast. Preparedness is not an abstract concept. It is a living practice that determines whether communities can withstand the unimaginable. If you've followed this timeline, you've seen how quickly one event can become many, how response efforts are tested to their limits, and how resilience is forged in the smallest acts of courage. The lessons of Kamchatka are not confined to its borders. They belong to all of us who live on a restless planet. Stay aware. Stay ready. And if you want more in-depth, fact-driven coverage of global disasters, their causes, and their lessons, make sure you subscribe to Crisis Lens. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next breakdown, and share this video to spread awareness. Because the more people understand how disasters unfold, the better we all can prepare for the day when the ground shakes, the sea rises, or the sky turns dark.